The same Pacific waters that can shield Florida from hurricanes can also drown California in floods and set the stage for deadly wildfires. That contradiction is the essence of El Niño, the warm phase of the ENSO cycle, and it is why this Pacific phenomenon matters so deeply to Americans. While El Niño tends to reduce the number of hurricanes that batter the Atlantic coast, it simultaneously tilts the climate dice toward chaos along the Pacific coast, where storms, floods, and fire seasons intensify. What feels like a relief for one part of the country can be a nightmare for another. And history has shown just how costly these patterns can be for farmers, insurers, and taxpayers across the United States. El Niño is often described in simple terms, a warming of the equatorial Pacific waters near Peru and Ecuador. But the chain reaction it triggers in the atmosphere is anything but simple. Those warmer waters shift the focus of thunderstorms eastward, tugging the Pacific jet stream south and east into the United States. The jet stream becomes a delivery belt for storm systems that slam into California and sweep across the southern states. At the same time, those atmospheric changes create hostile wind conditions over the Atlantic Ocean, tearing apart developing hurricanes before they can grow into monsters. This is why El Niño seasons often see fewer hurricanes making landfall in places like Florida or the Carolinas, but why California and the West brace for a storm parade. To residents of the Gulf Coast and Florida, El Niño can feel like a gift. When the Atlantic quiets down, there are fewer emergency evacuations, fewer homes destroyed, and fewer lives lost. Insurance companies breathe easier. Families enjoy summers without the constant anxiety of hurricane forecasts. But to residents of California, El Niño's arrival often means mudslides burying highways, swollen rivers spilling over levees, and entire neighborhoods facing disaster declarations. The Pacific storms that ride in on the altered jet stream can bring more rain in a single season than some areas receive in multiple years. For communities built on fragile hillsides or along rivers already narrowed by development, the damage is immense. The 1997-98 El Niño is the perfect case study. Known as the El Niño of the century, it brought relentless rain to California. Entire neighborhoods were washed away by mudslides. The Central Valley, America's agricultural powerhouse, faced both benefits and devastation. Reservoirs filled, providing drought relief, but fields flooded, destroying crops and infrastructure. More than $1 billion in damages piled up across the state. The southern US was not spared either. In Florida, El Niño brought one of the worst tornado outbreaks in the state's history. On February 22, 1998, violent storms ripped through central Florida, killing 42 people and injuring hundreds more. The tornadoes struck at night when people were sleeping, making the event even more deadly. Meanwhile, across the Midwest and Northeast, the winter was unusually mild, confusing ecosystems and disrupting seasonal economies. While water was pouring into some regions, El Niño was setting the stage for fire elsewhere. After the rains, California's hillsides grew thick with vegetation. Months later, when the summer heat returned, that lush growth dried into perfect wildfire fuel. What began as floods ended as flames, a 1-2 punch that devastated communities already reeling from storm damage. This pattern, wet winters followed by fiery summers, is one of El Niño's most dangerous legacies in the West. The economic toll of strong El Niño events is staggering. Farmers bear heavy losses when floods swamp fields or when wet conditions trigger plant diseases. Vineyards, orchards, and vegetable growers in California have seen harvests ruined during major El Niño years. The livestock sector suffers too, as pastures flood and feed prices rise. Insurance companies face surges in claims not just from property damage but also from crop insurance payouts. Federal disaster relief spending skyrockets, pulling billions from taxpayers to rebuild roads, restore communities, and assist farmers. During the 1997-98 El Niño alone, damages in the United States exceeded $10 billion. Globally, the event is estimated to have caused $35 billion in losses. Even beyond agriculture and insurance, ordinary Americans feel the financial strain. When federal funds are diverted to cover disaster recovery, budgets for infrastructure, schools, and other public services feel the pinch. Taxpayers contribute to recovery whether they live in California, Florida, or Maine. At the same time, disruptions in food production raise grocery prices. When California's produce fields flood, the cost of lettuce, tomatoes, and fruit rises in supermarkets nationwide. When energy infrastructure is damaged by storms, heating and electricity bills fluctuate. In this way, El Niño's fingerprints touch the wallet of every American family. What makes El Niño especially challenging is that its impacts are not uniform. In some places, the extra rainfall is a blessing. Reservoirs refill, easing water restrictions. Hydroelectric dams rake more power. Farmers who avoid floods see bumper crops. But just a few miles away, neighbors may lose everything to flash floods or landslides. The same rainfall that saves one community can destroy another. This unevenness makes preparation and planning difficult. Policymakers must weigh both the benefits and the risks, trying to maximize the good while minimizing the harm. California's infrastructure tells this story. Reservoirs are designed to capture rain and snowmelt, but during strong El Niños, inflows can overwhelm dams. In 1997, the Feather River in Northern California surged to dangerous levels, forcing emergency releases from reservoirs and threatening downstream towns. Billions of dollars in levee upgrades have been spent since then, but El Niño remains a constant test. Meanwhile, in Southern California, homes perched on unstable slopes are at risk every winter when heavy rains turn dry hills into rivers of mud. Year after year, headlines repeat. Families evacuated, roads buried, entire houses sliding away. Each time, insurers pay, governments pay, and communities struggle to recover. For the southern United States, El Niño means stormier winters. The altered jet stream channels more systems across states, like Texas, Louisiana, Alabama, and Florida. Floods become more common, tornado outbreaks more intense. In 1998, Florida's deadly tornadoes revealed just how dangerous these El Niño-linked storms can be. Families who thought they had been spared from hurricanes found themselves blindsided by a different kind of disaster. Even today, meteorologists warn that El Niño winters can bring severe weather outbreaks to the south, and emergency planners prepare accordingly. Meanwhile, the Northeast often experiences mild winters during El Niño. Snowfalls are lighter, heating bills fall, and cities enjoy a reprieve from blizzards. On the surface, this seems like a benefit. But for ski resorts in states like Vermont and New York, milder winters are a financial blow. Tourism revenue drops, workers lose jobs, and local economies suffer. Municipal snow budgets go unused in some years, only to be stretched thin in others when La Niña returns. This cycle of boom and bust is another economic ripple of El Niño, one that reaches even those who never feel its storms directly. Globally, scientists estimate that El Niño's economic footprint can slow GDP growth, alter trade balances, and destabilize economies. For the United States, a country deeply tied to agriculture, energy, and global trade, those impacts cascade. When California fields flood, when Gulf Coast refineries are threatened, when insurance claims rise, the costs circle back to the national economy. Every American pays a share of the bill, whether through higher food prices, increased premiums, or federal tax dollars spent on disaster aid. What makes El Niño especially striking is how consistent its patterns can be. Fewer Atlantic hurricanes, stormier winters in the south, wetter conditions in California, and milder winters in the Northeast. Scientists can recognize these fingerprints and forecast them with growing confidence. NOAA's ENSO outlooks now allow months of warning, giving communities a chance to prepare. But even with this warning, the damages persist. Forecasting does not stop mudslides, it only gives us the chance to move people out of the way. Forecasting does not prevent floods, it only allows engineers to adjust reservoir levels in advance. The Pacific gives us a signal, but how we act on it determines the ultimate outcome. For Americans, El Niño is a reminder that climate and economy are inseparably linked. A shift of 1 or 2 degrees in the Pacific can alter the lives of millions. It can save Florida from hurricanes while devastating California with floods. It can lower heating bills in New York while raising grocery prices nationwide. It can fatten one farmer's harvest while wiping out another's, and it can push federal disaster spending into the billions, reshaping priorities for years to come. When people hear the word El Niño, they often think of abstract weather science, of ocean temperatures and distant storms. But the reality is much closer to home. El Niño is the quiet architect of seasons, deciding which parts of America will be spared and which will suffer. Its story is not told only in meteorological charts, but in ruined crops, flooded homes, insurance payouts, and taxpayer dollars. It is told in the relief of a quiet hurricane season and the anguish of families swept away by floods. It is a story every American lives, even if they do not know its name. As this series continues, we will see how El Niño has shaped America's past and how it continues to shape its future. We will examine the disasters that revealed its power, the economic costs that ripple across society, and the preparations that can blunt its worst effects. El Niño is both protector and destroyer, calm in the Atlantic and chaos in the West. Understanding it is not optional. It is essential for survival in a nation so deeply tied to the whims of weather. The 1997-98 El Niño was so powerful, so disruptive, and so unforgettable that it became known as the El Niño of the century. It revealed to the world just how much influence a patch of warm Pacific water could wield, reshaping weather patterns not just across the tropics but across entire continents. For the United States, it was a season of extremes, of benefits mingled with devastation, of quiet in the Atlantic but fury on the Pacific coast. More than any other event, the 1997-98 El Niño taught Americans that what happens off the coast of Peru is not far away. It is here, in our backyards, our rivers, and our budgets. The story begins in the spring of 1997, when satellites and ocean buoys began detecting unusual warming in the central and eastern Pacific. By summer, the signals were unmistakable. Sea surface temperatures across thousands of miles were several degrees above normal. NOAA declared that one of the strongest El Niño events on record was unfolding. Across the globe, scientists, farmers, insurers, and governments braced themselves for what was coming. In California, the impacts were immediate and relentless. The jet stream, shifted southward by El Niño, aimed storm after storm at the Golden State. Rains pounded the coast, hillsides collapsed, and rivers overflowed. In Los Angeles County, mudslides swept away homes built on unstable slopes. In Northern California, swollen rivers threatened levees and inundated farmland. The storms tested dams and reservoirs, forcing engineers to release water in emergency maneuvers. Roads buckled, bridges failed, and entire neighborhoods were left underwater. By the time the rains ended, California had suffered more than $1 billion in damages. Yet even amid the destruction, reservoirs filled, drought eased, and some farmers celebrated a rare abundance of water. The paradox of El Niño was on full display. Disaster for some, relief for others. In Florida, El Niño revealed a darker face. While the Atlantic hurricane season was subdued, the state faced an unexpected enemy: tornadoes. On the night of February 22, 1998, Central Florida endured one of the deadliest tornado outbreaks in its history. Storms spun out of the dark sky, striking while families slept. 42 people died, hundreds were injured, and thousands of homes were destroyed. Survivors described waking to the sound of shattering glass, rushing winds, and houses tearing apart around them. The tornadoes were fueled by the same El Niño jet stream that was flooding California, a reminder that even in places spared from hurricanes, El Niño delivered danger in new forms. Other parts of the South also suffered. Texas endured widespread flooding as saturated ground turned small storms into major disasters. Bridges washed away, ranches were cut off, and farmlands lay drowned under feet of water. Farmers lost not only crops but also critical planting time for the next season, compounding the economic damage. Insurance claims surged, and federal disaster declarations spread across multiple states. In the Midwest and Northeast, the winter of 1997-98 was unusually mild. Snowfall was far below average, and heating demand dropped sharply. Families welcomed lower energy bills, but businesses that relied on cold and snow struggled. Ski resorts across the Northeast reported dramatic losses, some closing early or laying off workers. Local economies built on winter tourism faltered. Ice-dependent industries faced chaos as lakes failed to freeze, disrupting transport and recreation alike. Wildlife and ecosystems were confused. Migratory birds altered their patterns, pests survived in greater numbers, and farmers faced unexpected challenges in planting and pest control. Economically, the 1997-98 El Niño was a behemoth. Damages in the United States alone exceeded $10 billion. Globally, the figure was closer to $35 billion. The costs were spread across multiple sectors. Agriculture suffered from floods in some regions and drought in others. Transportation networks faced billions in repairs to roads, bridges, and rail lines damaged by floods and landslides. Insurance companies saw surging claims from property damage and crop losses. The federal government poured billions into disaster relief, straining budgets and diverting funds from other priorities. Taxpayers ultimately bore the burden, whether they lived in the disaster zones or not. But there were also winners. Hydroelectric dams in the West benefited from abundant water, generating cheap electricity. Farmers with fields spared from flooding enjoyed bumper crops nourished by plentiful rain. Energy consumers in the Northeast saved millions on heating costs during the mild winter. The very unevenness of El Niño meant that while some sectors bled, others thrived. The challenge was not just the magnitude of its effects, but the inequality of their distribution. The global picture made the 1997-98 El Niño even more sobering. Indonesia endured massive wildfires fueled by drought. Peru and Ecuador, at the heart of the warming Pacific, suffered catastrophic floods. Australia faced drought, while East Africa endured deadly flooding. The ripple effect of one ocean warming was planetary. For Americans, this global chaos mattered too. Trade networks were disrupted, international food prices spiked, and global aid spending stretched thin. The United States was reminded that El Niño was not just a domestic issue, but part of an interconnected world economy. What made the 1997-90 El Niño stand out was not just its strength, but its clarity. The fingerprints were everywhere. Fewer Atlantic hurricanes, stronger Pacific storms, wetter California, stormier southern states, milder northern winters. The patterns matched scientific expectations almost perfectly, boosting confidence in the ability of climate science to predict ENSO impacts. For the public, this event turned El Niño from a scientific curiosity into a household name. News outlets covered it extensively, and Americans learned that a warm patch of Pacific water could decide whether their winter was wet, dry, warm, or stormy. Yet despite the forecasts, the damages mounted. Warnings had gone out months in advance, but infrastructure was still overwhelmed, families were still blindsided, and losses were still catastrophic. The lesson was clear: forecasting is not enough. Without investment in stronger levees, safer building codes, better emergency systems, and public awareness, even the best predictions cannot prevent losses. El Niño is a test of preparedness, not just a test of science. For farmers, the lesson was bitter. Some who celebrated full reservoirs later faced fields too soggy to plant. Others who hoped for relief from drought found themselves battling pests and diseases fueled by unusual weather. Livestock operations faced outbreaks linked to wet conditions. Even when forecasts predicted wetter than normal conditions, the details, where, when, how much, were too vague to save every crop. Farmers shouldered billions in losses, much of it uninsured. For insurers, the event was a wake-up call. Catastrophe models were recalibrated, premiums adjusted, and risk pools reconsidered. The realization that El Niño could affect multiple regions simultaneously, floods in the west, tornadoes in the south, economic losses in the northeast, forced the industry to rethink how it priced risk. Homeowners paid the price in higher premiums, while some insurers pulled back from high-risk areas altogether. For taxpayers, the cost was unavoidable. Federal disaster declarations spread across state after state, triggering billions in relief spending. Roads had to be rebuilt, levees repaired, communities supported. The Federal Emergency Management Agency and other agencies stretched their budgets, while Congress approved supplemental spending. The bill landed on the national balance sheet, a reminder that every American pays when El Niño strikes hard, whether they live in California, Florida, or New York. In hindsight, the 1997-98 El Niño was both a tragedy and a teacher. It showed how one climate phenomenon could simultaneously reduce hurricane risk in one region while amplifying floods, tornadoes, and fires in others. It demonstrated the enormous economic stakes of ENSO events, and it made clear that preparedness is not just a local responsibility, but a national one. When the Pacific shifts, the entire country shifts with it. The memory of 1997-98 lingers today. Each new El Niño is measured against it. Forecasts ask, will it be as strong? Will the impacts be as widespread? Scientists continue to study the event to refine models and improve predictions. Emergency planners recall its disasters to guide training and preparation. And communities remember the losses, lives lost to floods and tornadoes, farms destroyed, neighborhoods buried in mudslides. For Americans, the 1997-98 El Niño remains the benchmark. It proved that distant oceans can dictate local fates. It revealed the fragility of infrastructure, the vulnerability of agriculture, and the interdependence of the economy. And it left behind a sobering truth. El Niño is not an occasional oddity, but a recurring part of our climate system. It will return, and when it does, the choices we make in preparation will decide whether we repeat the tragedies of the past or turn them into lessons for resilience. El Niño is not just a story of storms and weather maps. It is a story told in bank accounts, insurance ledgers, government budgets, and dinner table prices. Every time the Pacific warms, the consequences reach far beyond the coasts and fields. Farmers lose crops, insurers pay out billions, and taxpayers everywhere foot the bill for disaster relief. El Niño is not simply a meteorological phenomenon. It is an economic shockwave that tests the resilience of the American economy at every level. The costs begin in the fields and pastures of American agriculture. Farmers rely on stable weather to time planting, irrigation, and harvest. El Niño disrupts that rhythm. In California, heavy rains flood fields, rot crops, and trigger outbreaks of plant diseases. Vineyards lose grapes, orchards lose fruit, and vegetable growers lose entire harvests under waterlogged soil. In Florida, tornado outbreaks linked to El Niño can flatten fields, destroy greenhouses, and kill livestock. In Texas, floods sweep across ranch land, drowning cattle and eroding topsoil. In other years, the pattern flips. El Niño may bring too much rain early, then parched conditions later, leaving farmers unable to predict yields or profits. For small family farms, these shocks can be devastating. A single failed season can push a farm into debt, forcing families to sell land or livestock. Even large agribusinesses suffer. When fields go under, processing plants and distribution networks sit idle. Rural communities built around farming lose jobs, income, and tax revenue. The costs ripple outward. Consumers notice higher grocery prices as supply chains struggle to adapt. A flood in California's Central Valley means pricier tomatoes in New York supermarkets. A storm-damaged orange grove in Florida means higher juice prices nationwide. Livestock operations are equally vulnerable. Heavy rains and floods destroy feed supplies, spread diseases, and reduce grazing land. In some El Niño years, ranchers cull herds early, flooding the market with beef and temporarily lowering prices. But when the herds are gone, shortages drive prices back up. Dairy farms face similar cycles as flooded barns, ruined feed, and stressed animals reduce production. For farmers already operating on thin margins, El Niño is the difference between survival and bankruptcy. Insurance companies feel the next wave of costs. Every flood, mudslide, tornado, and wildfire during an El Niño season translates into claims. Homeowners file for property damage, farmers file for crop losses, businesses file for business interruption. The insurance industry calculates these risks with sophisticated models, but El Niño years often exceed expectations. In 1997-98, insurers paid billions in claims across multiple states. The unpredictability of when and where El Niño will strike makes it difficult to set premiums accurately. In response, companies raise rates broadly, pulling more money from households and businesses, even in areas that may not be directly hit. For homeowners, this means insurance premiums climb year after year. In flood-prone California counties, policies become unaffordable or insurers withdraw altogether. In Florida, even with fewer hurricanes during El Niño, premiums remain high because of the risk of tornadoes and floods. For farmers, crop insurance becomes more expensive, and some crops become uninsurable in high-risk areas. The burden shifts to the public sector, with the federal government stepping in to subsidize coverage or provide emergency payouts. Once again, the taxpayer becomes the insurer of last resort. And that leads to the largest cost of all, federal disaster relief. Every El Niño season that floods rivers, triggers mudslides, or spawns tornado outbreaks is followed by a stream of federal aid. The Federal Emergency Management Agency, the Department of Agriculture, and countless other agencies mobilize funds to rebuild homes, repair roads, restore farms, and support displaced families. In 1997-98, US damages exceeded $10 billion, much of it covered by federal relief. These funds come from taxpayers everywhere, not just those living in the disaster zones. A family in Ohio or Maine may never see El Niño storms firsthand, but their tax dollars help rebuild California levees and Florida homes. The costs extend into infrastructure. Roads washed out by floods must be rebuilt. Levees overtopped by rivers must be reinforced. Power grids knocked down by storms must be repaired. Public works budgets are drained, and long-term projects are delayed. Schools close, hospitals strain, and businesses lose productivity. The economic damage is not just the direct cost of disasters, but the opportunity cost of stalled growth, lost education, and delayed investment. The taxpayer burden grows even heavier when you consider that El Niño is not a one-time event. It recurs every few years, each time demanding billions. Federal, state, and local budgets are caught in a cycle of response and recovery. Prevention and preparedness often receive less funding than emergency relief, even though economists agree that every dollar spent on mitigation saves multiple dollars in recovery. Yet political cycles reward quick fixes and visible aid, not long-term resilience. The result is a recurring bill that taxpayers must pay again and again. The broader economy feels El Niño in countless subtle ways. Commodity markets swing as floods or droughts alter yields of corn, wheat, soybeans, and cotton. Traders in Chicago watch ENSO forecasts as closely as farmers in Iowa. Energy markets shift as storms threaten oil refineries or as mild winters reduce heating demand. Transportation networks falter when floods close highways or when rail lines are washed out. Tourism suffers when ski resorts lose snow or when coastal communities are battered by storms. Even healthcare costs rise as El Niño-linked disasters lead to injuries, diseases, and stress-related illnesses. Globally, the costs compound. El Niño disrupts weather across multiple continents, causing food shortages, trade imbalances, and humanitarian crises. The United States, as a global economic power, feels these shocks through higher import prices, disrupted supply chains, and increased foreign aid commitments. American taxpayers not only fund domestic disaster relief, but also contribute to international aid when El Niño devastates countries abroad. The Pacific warming becomes a drain on wallets far from the coast. Yet amid the billions lost, there are also billions saved. Remember, El Niño suppresses Atlantic hurricanes. For Florida and the Gulf Coast, this often means fewer catastrophic landfalls. A quiet hurricane season can save insurers billions and spare taxpayers costly relief operations. In this sense, El Niño acts as both a blessing and a curse. It protects one region while punishing another. The problem is that the benefits and costs are rarely balanced. The storms that El Niño fuels in California or the tornadoes it stirs in Florida can outweigh the savings from a quiet Atlantic. The net result is usually a loss for the national economy, even when some regions benefit. The human cost must also be counted. Every flooded neighborhood, every destroyed farm, every storm-damaged business is a story of families uprooted, dreams delayed, and communities shaken. Insurance payouts and federal aid can rebuild structures, but they cannot erase trauma. Survivors of the 1998 Florida tornadoes still recall the terror of waking to collapsing roofs. Families in California still remember watching their homes slide down hillsides in mud. The true cost of El Niño is measured not just in dollars, but in lives disrupted. What can be done? Economists and scientists agree that better preparation is the key. Investments in flood defenses, stronger building codes, and early warning systems can save billions. Farmers can adapt with more resilient crops, improved irrigation, and diversified planting strategies. Insurers can refine models to price risk more fairly. Governments can shift funds toward prevention instead of only response. But all of this requires public awareness and political will. Too often, the urgency fades after the storms pass, and the cycle of unpreparedness begins anew. El Niño is not going away. It is part of Earth's natural rhythm, recurring every 2 to 7 years. With climate change, some scientists believe its impacts may intensify. Warmer oceans could fuel stronger El Niño events, amplifying floods, fires, and economic disruption. That makes preparation even more critical. Americans cannot control the Pacific, but they can control how ready they are when it shifts. As we close this second video in our ENSO series, remember the dual nature of El Niño. It calms the Atlantic, sparing Florida and the Gulf from hurricanes, but it unleashes chaos on the west coast and across the south. It saves billions in one place while costing billions in another. Farmers, insurers, and taxpayers all feel its reach, whether through lost harvests, rising premiums, or disaster relief bills. The Pacific's warming waters may be thousands of miles away, but their costs land squarely in American wallets. At Crisis Lens, our mission is to shine light on these hidden forces, disasters that seem far away but shape our lives every day. By understanding El Niño, we can better prepare for the floods, fires, and storms it brings, and we can make smarter choices as a nation about how to invest in resilience. If you found this exploration valuable, help us grow this conversation. Subscribe to Crisis Lens, hit the notification bell, and share this video with your friends and family. The more people who understand the true costs of El Niño, the better prepared we will all be when the Pacific warms again.